Before we get started, I wanted to make sure that you were prepared for the next series of videos. The videos that I'm going to be doing now are going to merge together, are going to combine the ideas of models that we started with in views. And in the Python shell videos that we did that I did in the previous series, we built a project called Company that included an HR added application. You're going to need this project to be able to do the next series of videos. It does build on that. So the HR application included a model with employees and departments. And if you did not complete that project, then please make sure to go back to the videos and construct that project before continuing. I want to emphasize this video is incredibly important. This series is incredibly important because we're going to get a little bit more complicated, a little bit more, we're going to shift in how we configure projects, and it is very important that you understand this before the rest of the semester. Thanks so much. The next series of videos are going to cover integrating two of the most important topics we've talked about so far, and that is the models, which are of course the data, as well as the views, which of course are the logic. We've talked about them separately, but it's important to understand how these fit together. The concepts that we talked about in the models, especially the stuff that we talked about in the shell, will come into play in this video, as well as the material that we talked about with the views. So follow along with me carefully, and we'll walk you through this so that you can understand how to integrate the models and the views. The last piece of the model view template framework will be, of course, the templates, and that will be in the next module of the course. I wanted to review briefly the structure of a project in Django. It does bear some repeating. We talked about this. We're going to keep this format consistent throughout the semester, and that's because it's a lot easier to be able to find things and for me to be consistent with you every time we talk about this, these projects. So the first is the project folder, which is basically the outer container. We then have the project root, which contains the project. Which contains the website, and then we have the default app folder. It is important that you understand that the default app is created when you issue the Django admin command. You'll notice the name is company, and the names of the outer folders also have the name company. That's how you know it's the default app. If you created a project called Homework1 or HW1, for example, your default app would be, of course, HW1. The root folder would be called HW1_root, and the outside folder would be HW1_project. We have a settings file. The settings file is the settings for the entire website. That is also very important to remember. Anything that is in the company folder covers the entire website. That is, if we add any applications for anything that we do with this, the settings file will still control all of that. And in a similar manner, the urls.py file is, as we've talked about, we call it the traffic cop. The urls.py file is the traffic cop for the entire website. All requests for this website will go through urls.py, and we'll talk about why that can be a problem in a few minutes. Finally, we have an added application. In this case, I added the application called HR, and I did this in an earlier video. We're going to build on this in this video as well as the next video, but this is called an added application. This is not a default app. This is an added application. And added applications are important because they typically contain their own models as well as their own views. So the HR application can have its own database structure, which can be different than, say, another added application. So that's why the added applications are so incredibly important. And in terms of the text on this slide, it's important to remember that the urls.py file handles all web requests. Now, as you can imagine, a website of any complexity can have a variety of different patterns, and the urls.py file can get very long, and it can be very, very hard to manage. Django really doesn't want you to dump everything into the main urls.py file. Instead, what it wants you to do is delegate the requests to the added applications. Now, in this particular project, we only have one added application, and that is HR, but a real website might have a half a dozen or more added applications, each representing a different database and each representing a different function within the company. So we're going to talk about in this video how to delegate requests so that instead of everything being handled by urls.py, the urls.py can pass off requests to another file or an added application. So let's take the situation for HR. The pattern after a root request, for example, HR/, then indicates that the request should be added by another application in the project. So the pattern immediately after the root, that is www.mycompany.com, for example, it might be www.mycompany.com/HR/. That pattern indicates that the HR application is going to handle the request, and it's going to get passed to that particular application. If we had something called product, which might handle inventory, for example, www.mycompany.com/product/ would then get delegated to the product application. So how do you do this? Well, first, in the default application's urls.py file, which we just saw, and that is in the default app, we need to import, there's a specific library function called include, and I've shown you how to do that here. The Django's .urls is already there, by the way. The import path is already there. You simply need to add the comma include, and that will add that functionality to the default app's urls.py file. Next, you need to tell the urls.py file what pattern is going to be delegated. In the example that I just gave you, we said that HR/ was going to be delegated. So in the path statement, you're going to say HR/, and then you're going to use the include function to indicate that the hr.urls file is going to handle any requests of that particular pattern. Now, hr.urls, what that means is the urls.py file in the HR application, the HR added application. And so what we're going to need to do then also is, of course, add a urls.py file in the HR application folder. Now, some of these files are already included. Views.py, for example, the HR added application automatically has a views.py file, but it doesn't have a urls.py file because you may or may not have one, and Django lets you add it if you want it. So we are going to need to add a urls.py file. Now, by the way, I'm not asking you to do this in this particular video. I'm giving you an overview of the process. The next video, I'm going to walk you through this process step by step so you can see exactly how this is done. So let's now that we have the urls.py file handled in the default app, that is the company application, what does the urls.py file look like in the HR application? Now, this is where it actually has to handle the request, okay? All the urls.py file in the default app, the company default app, is doing is passing it off to another file, and that is the urls.py file in HR, which we've just created. So the urls.py file in the HR application, that is really where it has to invoke the views. So you'll see I've added two paths here. In the first path is just empty, and you may recognize this. We've used this a number of times. In this case, two single quotes with no space between them is a root request, but remember, it passed the HR pattern. So what that means is, if you look over here, what that means is the request of this particular format, that is www.company.com/HR/ will invoke the go home view. That is the go home Python function. That's what's going to get invoked. If we have a pattern that looks like this, www.company.com/HR/employees/, that pattern will then be handled by the getEmployees method. You'll notice that it actually kind of makes sense because the hierarchy flows with what you're doing here. www.company.com is the entire company, /HR is the HR department, /employees is the particular function or specific request for information that you're making. So one of the reasons that Django, I think, works very well is that the URLs end up making sense, and that is that the slashes divide up the different hierarchies of a particular organization. This approach allows the HR application to control requests, especially for HR. It also makes the urls.py file much easier to manage because the requests are distributed to the relevant part of the website. So if we had for example, a product added application to handle inventory, the request would look like http://www.company.com/product/, and that might simply list all products in our organization. Now, ideally, the main urls.py file in a company should only really include statements, to be honest, delegating the request to each added application. Now, this may or may not be the case for our specific applications in this class, but conceptually, it works a lot better with Django if the urls.py file in the default app simply does include the include statements and forwards the requests onto the individual applications. Now, a word about templates. I know this was confusing, and I know there's a lot of details with Django that you got to remember. And I wish it wasn't quite this picky sometimes, because it does get frustrating. And one of the reasons I created these series of videos was to help you walk through this process. If you remember, whenever we wanted to add a template, that is an HTML file, to an application, we had to go through some configuration, which was kind of annoying, and it was a little bit arbitrary. So if you remember, if we add a templates folder to a project's root directory, okay, that is, in this case, company_root. If we add a templates folder, you have to do some configuration. You have to go into the settings.py file, and if you remember this DIRs that we did way back a couple weeks ago, you had to add this templates listing. Now, the reason this is kind of annoying and kind of seemingly arbitrary is that Django really doesn't want you to do it this way. We hadn't covered added applications. We hadn't added an application at that point. So it was really kind of hard for me to talk about it, because it was just another layer of complexity that I had to talk about. So it really, if you use added applications like HR or the product one that I've been talking about, it's a lot simpler, because Django is configured to look inside added applications for the templates automatically. The only thing you have to do is, if you have an added application like HR, is to add a folder called templates in that folder, and it will automatically find the HTML files. There's nothing else you have to do. So it's a lot easier if you use added applications in Django. So to review here, we have, for example, the default app called company. It's not a good idea to put our templates folder in the root or into the default application. It's much better to use the added applications. So HR is a good example. So you have your HR folder, which is your folder for your added application. If you add a templates folder inside that HR folder and then put your HTML files in the templates folder, Django will find them automatically. It's much, much easier to find in that situation. No other configuration is needed. Now, coupled with what I said earlier about back here, where I talked about the main URL at the last entry here, the main URLs file and company should only contain the include statements. Similarly, if you really want HTML files to be handled by the default application like we did, you still got to go through this annoying configuration in the settings file. A better approach, honestly, is to create an added application called, let's say, called home, and then that added application, add a templates folder, and it will automatically be able to find that particular pattern. So that's what I recommend, but at the same time, I'm not going to require it. You still, of course, have to have a home page, but there are ways to use the include statement in the main urls.file to simply pass the request onto your new home added application. Now, we're gonna stop here for this particular video. The next video is going to walk you through the how to do this in the company application that we've been constructing. You should already have an HR added application in that project, and I'm going to walk you through how to do this.